When we think of the culinary world of antiquity, our minds are often deceived. History, filtered through the lens of Hollywood cinema and the magnificent frescoes excavated from the ashes of Pompeii, has woven a beautiful illusion. We are taught to imagine Roman emperors draped in pure white silk, reclining on velvet couches. We picture them surrounded by plump grapes, silver goblets overflowing with dark red wine, and extravagant banquets lasting through the night, heavy with the scent of roasted game. We simply assume that the food of the past was something slow, ceremonial, and overflowing with indulgence. But history is a magnificent liar, because it usually only records the lives of the 1%, the people standing at the very peak of the social pyramid. For the other 99% of the ancient world, the carpenters with calloused hands, the blacksmiths working in suffocating heat, the sailors exhausted from long voyages, and the tens of thousands of laborers dragging stone to build colossal amphitheaters, the reality of eating was entirely different. It was not luxurious. It was not slow, and it was as loud, chaotic, stressful, and sweat-drenched as a massive industrial kitchen during the peak rush hour of the 21st century. Eating out at an ancient restaurant was not born out of a desire to enjoy culinary arts. It did not emerge because someone wanted to taste a novel flavor. It was born out of a crisis. A crisis of the urban landscape, of space, of resources, and of course survival. To truly understand why, we must leave the marble palaces behind and step into the dark, suffocating alleyways of ancient Rome. At its peak, Rome was a massive supercity holding over 1 million people, cramming 1 million human beings into a confined space, long before modern building materials like steel and reinforced concrete were invented. The city was forced to grow vertically. The vast majority of the Roman working class lived in towering apartment blocks known as insulae. Forget the modern concept of an apartment. These insulae stretched 5 or 6 stories high, haphazardly constructed from cheap timber, mud brick, and poor quality mortar. There were no glass windows, there was no ventilation, there was no running water on the upper floors, and most importantly, there were no chimneys. In such a suffocating environment, living space was not the only luxury. Safety was the ultimate privilege. Cooking, at its core, is the art of controlling fire. But in the Insulae, fire was not a tool serving humanity. It was a monster waiting to swallow everything whole. Imagine this. You are a shoemaker living on the 4th floor of a dilapidated, entirely wooden building. After a grueling day of labor, you return home wanting to cook a hot dinner. To do so, you must light a charcoal brazier directly on your wooden floor. In a cramped room with no smoke exhaust, lighting a fire under those conditions was not cooking. It was a gamble with death, a single spark flying from the charcoal, a stray gust of wind blowing through the unglazed window, or a moment of carelessness when you fall asleep from pure exhaustion, could burn down not just your apartment but the entire city block, claiming hundreds of lives in a matter of minutes. In reality, fire was not a random accident in Rome. It was a permanent epidemic. Apartment blocks collapsing and bursting into flames happened so frequently that people accepted it as an inevitable part of urban life. Home cooking, therefore, was not the cozy family activity we imagine today. Home cooking was the exclusive privilege of the rich. It required you to own a sprawling stone villa, with isolated kitchens far from the living quarters, and an army of slaves standing by day and night just to ensure the flames did not spread. So, how did the 99% of poor citizens living in the Insulae manage to get a hot meal? They had no choice but to extinguish the flames in their own homes. They pushed the extreme danger of cooking out into the streets. The ancient working class did something that we assume belongs only to the modern industrial age. They outsourced the entire process of cooking. They took their empty stomachs and their copper coins, and they walked out of those dark wooden towers. Dining out, therefore, was never a choice of convenience. It was an enforced mechanism of survival. It was an unspoken pact made by the entire metropolis to ensure the city would not burn itself to the ground. And when tens of thousands of people without kitchens poured into the streets at the exact same time, desperately seeking something hot to restore their energy, after a day of bone-crushing labor, the first massive service machine in human history began to roar. If you walk along the cobblestone streets of the ruins of Pompeii or Ostia today, the physical traces of that madness are still there. They were called Thermopolia. a Latin word literally meaning places where hot things are sold. Do not imagine quiet restaurants with candlelight, wooden tables, and soft music. A thermopolium was not designed for you to sit back and enjoy. It was designed as a massive fueling machine. There were no hidden kitchens behind a curtain. The entire kitchen was exposed. It was a massive L-shaped masonry counter, sitting right on the edge of the noisy street. Embedded directly into that stone counter were the dolia, massive, hollow terracotta jars. This design was not an aesthetic choice. It was the absolute pinnacle of ancient industrial optimization. Those thick clay jars had incredible insulation. Inside them were not raw ingredients waiting for a chef to cook to order. There was no time for that kind of waiting. Inside were dozens of liters of lentil stews, meat scraps, eels, and snails that had already been brought to a rolling boil. Imagine the rhythm of the service then. The streets were flooded with the clattering of carts and the shouting of crowds. The customers, workers covered in dirt and sweat, approached the counter. They didn't look at a menu. They shouted what they wanted. A bronze coin was slammed onto the stone counter. Almost in the very next second, the vendor swung a massive ladle, scooped the steaming food from the clay jar straight into a bowl, and handed it over. It happened in seconds. Not minutes. The chaos, the speed, the sweat dripping from the vendor's forehead, and the relentless clinking of metal. That scene was no different from the most brutal industrial kitchens of today. It was humanity's first fast food chain, running on volume and speed because their customers had no time. They were the cogs of an empire, and cogs need immediate fueling to keep turning. So, what did they eat in those steaming fast food machines? If you handed a thermopolium menu to a modern food critic, they might grimace in disgust. The food here did not pursue refinement. It cared nothing for the balance of flavors or the art of plating. It pursued one single purpose: biological survival. The standard meal for a Roman laborer was a rough, rock-hard loaf of dark bread, used to dip into a thick stew made of lentils or fava beans. Beans were the cheapest source of protein in the ancient world, a perfect substitute for the fresh meat that the poor rarely had the chance to touch. And to create flavor, they used garum. It was a fermented fish sauce made from fish intestines left to sit in the sun for months. It was pungent, sharp, and incredibly salty. Today, we might dismiss it as too foul-smelling and unrefined. But for workers toiling 12 hours a day under the scorching Mediterranean sun, garum was not just a seasoning. It was salt. It was minerals. It was the only thing that saved them from dehydration, replenishing the massive amounts of sweat lost at the stone quarries. That menu is a brutal testament to how economics shape our taste. The customers here were not eating to savor the juiciness of a steak. They were eating dense calories, salt, and massive amounts of carbohydrates. They swallowed bowls of cheap pork or goat scraps boiled with mushrooms. Anything that was cheap and easy to preserve. The ancient kitchen was not a celebration of culinary art. It was a survival laboratory, where people found every possible way to cram enough energy into the human body at the lowest possible cost. Because of the noise and that pungent menu, the Roman elite deeply despised the Thermopolia. The great philosopher Seneca once wrote a bitter complaint when he had the misfortune of living above a bathhouse with a food stall below. He described the horror of the deafening sounds, the clinking of coins, the brawls of drunks, the shrill cries of sausage vendors, and the overwhelming smells rising from the kitchens to the wealthy senators who dined in quiet banquet halls decorated with frescoes where slaves poured wine directly into their mouths. Eating on the street was a mark of the lower class. They saw these stalls as dens of vice, gambling, prostitutes, and the filth of the lowest dregs of society. But history always has two sides. From the perspective of the poor, the commoners who had to return every night to sleep in dark, cold, suffocating, and dangerous wooden rooms, the Thermopolium meant something entirely different. It was not just a place to buy food. It was their living room. Around those L-shaped stone counters, the social fabric of the ancient working class was woven. They sat together, shared the warmth from the vendor's fire, drank wine diluted with water, played dice, argued about gladiator fights, and complained about taxes. For them, that loud, dirty, and smoky stall was the very center of their political and social life. It was the only place in that vast, indifferent city where they truly felt like living human beings. Today, when we look into busy restaurants, hear the relentless buzzing of ticket machines, the head chef shouting orders, and see the sheer exhaustion on the sweat-drenched faces of the line cooks. We often assume that this is the pressure of modern capitalism. We think the food service industry only became this frantic in the digital age. But the truth is, that furious rhythm was established over 2,000 years ago. The fire still roars, the sweat still drops, and speed is still the line between survival and failure. Ancient restaurants did not sell relaxation. They sold time, they sold calories, and they sold safety to those who could not afford to light a fire themselves. We have always arrogantly believed that humans freely choose their food and how they eat. But in reality, throughout the long history of human civilization, it was the cramped nature of the city, the high cost of resources, and the ruthless pressure of survival that wrote the menu and shaped how we eat a very long time ago.